Few cars typify 1950s era design more than the 1959 Chevrolet Impala that you see here. These so-called batwing fins were a trademark for the 59 Impala and gave it a different look versus other more vertically oriented fins, including those on various Chryslers that really precipitated this 1959 Impala design. More on that in a little bit. But what we're going to talk about today are the top 10 features of the 1959 Impala that you maybe didn't know about. And, well, put a comment in the comment section if you knew about these. Which ones did you know about? Which ones did you not know about? And which did I forget that you think are important? Because I admittedly don't know everything. So let's talk a little bit more about this 1959 Impala. And at number 10, we have that your 1959 Impala could be equipped with either a one-piece or three-piece rear bumper. Yes, that's right. There were two different bumpers that were employed on the 1959 Impala. One was a three-piece design and one was a single-piece design. And cars, as an example, that were sold in Canada, I believe, had the single-piece design, and those sold in California also had the single-piece design. The three-piece design was really used in most other places, and the reason for that was that if you got in a collision, you could just replace the appropriate piece that was damaged. You didn't have to replace the entire bumper assembly. So if you're looking at the 1959 Impalas at a local car show, be sure to check the rear bumper and see what bumper it has. Some people prefer the one piece because it's cleaner. I think that the three piece looks just fine too. But that was a difference across the vehicles that many people don't know about. Let's talk about number 9. And at number 9, that is that the 59 Impala has a fake air extractor, let's say, on the top of the roof. Now, in 1958, the first year of the Impala, when it was introduced as both a sport coupe and a convertible, there was this fake air extractor vent that was placed on the top of the roof panel. And that had originally, designers intended that to be functional, that it would help remove the air from the cabin, basically give you some flow-through ventilation, have the air come in through the cowl, pass through the passenger cabin, and then come out that air vent on the top of the roof. However, during testing, it was revealed that that vent was placed in a low-pressure area, and therefore air was coming back into the car through it as opposed to exiting through it. And with that result, the decision was made just to make that vent fake. As opposed to relocating the vent, I guess designers really liked the visual placement of it, and, well, then it ended up where it was. It kind of reminds me of how on 80s era General Motors vehicles, on rear window, or I should say rear doors, how the divider for the rear window was placed really for aesthetic looks and not for function. Very few General Motors cars in the 80s, at least the front-wheel drive General Motors cars, had windows that went all the way down in the rear. And that's because the divider wasn't placed in the right location in order for the window to go all the way down. But I guess designers thought it looked better where it was located, and so they left it. Let's move on to number 8, and that is that the 59 Impala chassis actually formed the basis for Pontiacs outside of the U.S., including in Canada. Yes, that's right. Your wide-track Pontiac, if you ordered it in the U.S., did come with a Pontiac frame, and it was indeed a relatively wide track for the time. Gave the car a great stance, had the wheels pushed more out toward the corners. But in countries like Canada, the Pontiacs were actually based upon Chevrolets and had Chevrolet chassis componentry underneath them. As a result, the wheels, as you can see on this 1959 Parisienne, which was a Canadian model, there was the Parisienne, the Laurentian, the Stratochief from Pontiac in that year, the wheels were placed very far inboard because this is actually a Chevrolet Impala chassis. And in some model years, the wheelbase between the Chevrolet and the Pontiac is different, and so the wheels aren't even in the center of the wheel well on the Canadian cars because of that different wheelbase. It's kind of amazing that they did this. It was done really for economies of scale, and because Pontiacs in Canada were more budget-oriented vehicles than Chevrolets, because Pontiac was the dominant brand in Canada and far outsold Chevrolet really all the way up until the end of the brand. Pontiac was the mainstream brand in Canada, not Chevrolet, to the point that even GMC trucks outsold Chevrolet trucks. And I think that may even still be true in Canada today, but it was certainly for many years. So GM needed the economies of scale, and they wanted to build these in the same assembly plant. So they used the Chevrolet chassis, and that also helped them with import duties and restrictions that really made it not efficient from a cost standpoint to source components from the U.S. Canadian cars have their components sourced from Canadian-based suppliers during this time frame. And again, one of the reasons why GM was able to get economies of scale was commonizing the parts underneath across Chevrolet and Pontiac. So your Chevrolet Impala chassis isn't just an Impala chassis in Canada and for some overseas markets. It's also the basis for Pontiacs. Let's move on to number 7. And at number 7, we have that the steering wheel was redesigned between the 1958 and 1959 Chevrolet with just a slight variation. In 1958, Chevrolet had this beautiful steering wheel with a full circular horn ring on it that was a two-spoke design with kind of the Swiss cheese look to it that was supposed to give the car more of a racing look from the inside because, of course, you're racing your Impala around the local roads. But let's take a look now at the 1959 Impala steering wheel. And you'll see it's very similar, still has that two-spoke design with the Swiss cheese, if you will, from a design standpoint. But the horn ring now is only half of a horn ring. It's just on the lower portion of the steering wheel, not on the upper portion. And what happened there? Well, apparently it was found that owners of the 1958 Impala were breaking the horn ring, and the upper portion wasn't supported very well, and I guess people were getting rather aggressive with their horn ring, and it was snapping. And so Chevrolet redesigned the horn ring to just have that lower portion on it. Not really, I would say, all that much less functionality, but certainly looks a little bit different now that you notice that. And, well, kind of a cool quirk of the 59 Impala. Let's move on to number 6, and that is that the 59 Impala lost the fuel injection option that the 58 Impalas and the 57 Chevrolets also had. Now, fuel injection wasn't gone from the Chevrolet lineup. The Corvette, as an example, still had fuel injection as an option for a number of years subsequent to 1959. But for whatever reason, Chevrolet decided, probably due to low take rate, that they would eliminate the engine option from the lineup in 1959. So you could no longer get the wonderful ramjet fuel injection on your Impala engine. Now, you could get a 348 cubic inch engine under hood, which would later become the 409 cubic inch V8. And a lot of people called those boat anchors and didn't think they were all that great motors. And certainly, by, I'll say, more modern standards, even by the 1960s, the 348 and 409, they weren't all that great. They're kind of truck engines, if you will. But they weren't all that bad when they were behind, or under hood, I should say, in your 1959 Impala. But no more fuel injection for the 1959 model year in your full-size Chevrolets. You had to make do, unfortunately, with a carbureted vehicle. And, well, that was all they had. Let's move on to number 5, and that is that your 59 Impala has, I believe, the lowest seating position of any full-size automobile, at least American automobile, probably of all time. And why is this? Well, the 58 Impala, if you take a look at it, was a rather tall car, a little bit doughy in terms of its forms, but it was a relatively tall vehicle. But for 1959, designers wanted that lower, longer, wider look. And as a result, the roofline on the 59s, not just the Impala, but all the full-size cars for General Motors, was very low. The overall car height was just about 59 inches, I believe, on these vehicles. And so if you're standing, let's say you're a 6-foot-tall individual, the roofline comes up maybe to the mid-chest area when you're standing next to the car. It's very low. And when you get in the car, you also kind of have to duck down a little bit because the roofline is relatively low in these cars. Now, in order to get enough room for a hat, so to speak, on the interior, designers had to basically put the seat frame on the floor of the car. And these cars have a very legs-out seating position, almost akin to a sports car like my 82 Trans Am. It's about the same seating position in terms of how far you are off of the floor. I would say it's not uncomfortable. It's actually pretty comfortable, and I think that's why General Motors engineers probably were okay with it, because they felt that the seat comfort and the overall driving position was not something where you were going to get back pain, as an example, over the long haul or a long trip. But nonetheless, I'm guessing it proved challenging for people with aging joints to get out of the car and stand up. And there were quite a few complaints. So in 1961, the designers would revise that seating position or the H point higher. And that would allow better ingress and egress. I think less people complain, but that was just a case on the 59s because the overall car was so low and they wanted to have appropriate headroom. But you will notice if you sit in a 59 full-size GM car that it's just a different seating position than really any other full-size car from General Motors that I've ever sat in, or from Ford or Chrysler for that matter. Let's move on to number 4, and that is your 59 Impala is at least partially a Buick. Well, what do I mean by that? You have to first understand that the 1959 General Motors full-size vehicles were rushed to market as a response to the redesign that Chrysler executed in 1957. When GM designers, the story is absolutely true, where designers were driving by the Chrysler plant on Mound Road in the Detroit, Michigan area, and they looked at the vehicles that were being produced and stocked in the lot there. In other words, the new 1957 models, and they were just gobsmacked at how beautiful the 57 Chryslers were, the forward-look Chryslers. Very thin roofs, beautiful fins, very tight, I would say, surfacing compared to the pudgy and doughy and blobby looks that others had, and certainly much leaner than what General Motors was churning out at the time frame and planning to churn out for, as an example, the 1958 model year. Cars like the 58 Buick Limited that just had, well, I don't know what you call them, buzz bombs and slats and hoop scoops and everything all over the vehicle. Just a lot of visual, I don't know, theater. And the Chryslers just looked so much more modern by comparison. In fact, Chrysler's ad campaign during the time said suddenly it's 1960. And those 57 Chryslers would end up propelling Plymouth, as an example, back to the number 3 sales spot overall in the United States. It had been displaced and was all the way down to the number 7 sales spot for a number of years. And in fact, Buick was number 3 for a few years in that mid-50s time frame. In any event, when GM designers saw the 57 Chryslers, they knew that what they were designing for 59 at the time, because remember, you're designing cars several years in advance of when they actually come out. They knew that the 59 designs that were being proposed were just not going to be satisfactory, and they needed to really go in a completely different direction. And as a result, they had to do a melt and repour on their designs, and there wasn't much time left to execute the design. So in order to save time and also save cost, Buick took the lead on designing the front door, as an example, and all General Motors division full-size cars used that Buick door, Buick front door, and basically had to integrate that surfacing into the overall design. Now, the cars also used the same windshields, the same roof lines, the same door inners, the same floor pans in some cases. They had a tremendous amount of shared components. They did have unique front ends and rear ends to give them the visual distinction, and that frankly worked. But they did have a lot of common components overall just in that midsection of the vehicle and with the roof lines and with the front doors. And like I said, Buick was the one that took the lead on the design for the front door. So your Impala at least has some Buick in it because of that reason. And I have to speculate a little bit that it might be because of the success of the 1959 cars that GM got a little bit overconfident in thinking what it could share in terms of body panels for cost savings, because it was so effective for 1959. The problem was that when the cars shrunk, like in the 1980s, and you had much less real estate to really work with, that if you kept that midsection of the car, as GM did on the X cars and the A bodies and the front-wheel drive cars, you could even say the C and H bodies, that the cars really just looked kind of similar, despite the fact that they had somewhat different front and rear ends. So I think that the 59s also got GM a bit overconfident when it came to badge engineering because they were so successful. Let's move on to number 3, and this is a comment related to the fins on the 59 Chevrolet, and that is that the depth of the fins was really due to this combination of Harley Earl and then Chief Engineer Ed Cole really trying to outdo one another with the 59 Impala. As recounted by then Chevrolet Chief Designer Claire McKeegan, the depth of the fins and the sculpture that you see, look at how just kind of hollowed out that rear end is, was dictated not just by the styling group, GM Styling led by Harley Earl at the time, But apparently Harley Earl and Ed Cole had this symbiotic relationship, and they were kind of in a good and productive way trying to outdo one another. They wanted these 59 Chevrolets to just be beautiful vehicles that were going to delight customers. And as a result, McKeegan said that Ed Cole would actually visit GM Styling on a rather frequent basis, and he was welcome in the Chevrolet studio, which was kind of atypical for an engineer to be welcome in the design studios. But he was welcome, and designers really enjoyed working with him. And McKeegan recounted how they were sculpting the fins, and Harley Earl would come in and take a little bit more of the clay for a clay model out of that area around the 1959s to give the fins more depth. But McKeegan also said that Ed Cole would come in as the chief engineer and grab some tools that were used for modeling clay and scrape out even more of the clay surface to make it look more accentuated. So here you have the engineer who's actually making things harder for himself and his team by accentuating the design, and that's why you get this tremendous depth on the 1959 Chevrolets in terms of that fin was apparently because both of those individuals are trying to outdo one another. I think the result is just spectacular. The rear three-quarter view of the 59 Impala is iconic in every sense of the word, but it's because of that relationship between the chief designer and chief engineer and also the chief stylist, Harley Earl, that the car ended up looking the way that it did. Let's move on to number 2. And that is that the 59 Impalas have an ingenious cost savings. And of course, because I'm a finance person, I have to talk about cost savings. And that is that the rear fin is a 2-piece design, and it's only metal finished part of the way up, not the full way. Now, back in 1959, metal finishing was costing about 75 cents to 80 cents per inch to metal finish. And, roughly multiply that by 10 to translate that into equivalent dollar terms today. So that's like $7.50, $8 an inch to metal finish. And you had to do it on 2 sides of the car because each is 2 pieces. So that overall metal finishing in today's terms probably was going to cost about $50. You had 3 inches, 4 inches, even more maybe even, of metal finishing that had to occur. And so one of the ingenious cost savings, because $50 a car is a heck of a lot of money, especially when you're churning out hundreds of thousands of cars, was that the decision was made to only metal finish the fin partway up. Now take a look at this photo, and you can actually see the seam on the underside of the fin. That's where the 2 pieces of metal would join up. And notice the seam disappears kind of partway down, and that's because below that it's metal finished and above it isn't. Now, why is that true? Why did they think that was okay? Well, when you're standing looking at the car, anybody of normal height, I would say, you don't even notice that it's not metal finished because the car is so low and the fin is so deep that is just not something that you see plainly. And so the decision was made to save a few dollars, actually more than a few dollars, and not metal finish that area because it was thought the customer couldn't see it. And well, why do it in that case? Customer can't see it, doesn't really matter. And so all of these 1959 Impalas, if you look underneath the fin, you'll see the seam right there. And if you're just standing looking at the car, you won't see anything for that reason. I thought that was a pretty ingenious cost savings. And that leaves us with number 1, and that is that the 1959 Impala went through many different design iterations before designers settled on the final iconic version. Now, why is this number 1? Well, you have to take a look at some of the design proposals that were being thought of here for the 59 Impala. Let's take a look at this one. Wow. The 4 headlight design, I guess kind of Edsel-esque in some ways, but you have the 2 headlights in the center, 2 on the outboard end. The overall styling of this vehicle is pretty close to the final vehicle, including the rear end treatment, which we'll see in a second. But that front end with the stacked headlights in the middle, I don't know if that was going to be the bright lights. I would guess it's the bright lights, and then the outer ends were going to be the regular headlights, is just over the top and wild. As I said, the rest of the car is relatively handsome, but I just can't imagine seeing this thing coming down the road. It's not very attractive at all. Certainly not as attractive as the final version. But sometimes, I guess, as a designer, you got to get these thoughts out of your system, and this was one of the thoughts they had to get out of their system before going on to, let's just say, a much better proposal. Now, if you look at the same vehicle out back, it does have those bat wing, let's say, fins out back, and it looks pretty similar to the final production car. However, if you compare this photograph with the one that I previously showed, you'll notice that the driver's side of this same clay model has this body side molding and some visual theater ahead of the rear wheel, let's call it, some chrome trim, whereas the previous photo did not. It was just plain. And I think designers were just experimenting with different things. I'm surprised they modeled the body side molding, because I don't know of a designer that doesn't hate body side moldings. But here one is on a car, and it's overly chunky, and I don't think looks very good. But, oh well, it's on the clay model. And notice the taillights here do have the 3-element design. It's a little bit different from typical. I don't know if the middle was supposed to be the reverse light, but it does have that 3-element design that the 58s had on the Impala. But for whatever reason, the production car didn't have that 3-element design. Chevrolet would return to that in 1960. So not quite sure what the thought was that went on there. But overall, pretty similar to the final design. Now let's look at an alternate proposal for the 59s that I believe would have been generated before the designers saw those Chryslers and then redid everything. Because this is really kind of a warmed over 58 look, if you will, and much less modern. The overall car is clearly much taller. I do like how the grille kind of spills over into the sides. The front end looks very Cadillac-y, including that V on the front, but this is a Chevrolet proposal. So Chevrolet was always trying to capitalize on being a bit of a baby Cadillac, and you can see that here in this particular vehicle. I think the front end's handsome. It's got a little bit of a 59 Plymouth front end look to me, but clearly the 59 Plymouth was not out by this point. But I think it's an attractive front end. Certainly one that, isn't necessarily hard on the eyes. But take a look at the rear of this same proposal and the double fin design, the horizontal fin as well as the vertical fin, this tremendous cove that's sculpted out of the back. I don't know how I feel about that vertical and horizontal fin. I don't think it looks too complicated. The designers didn't quite know what they wanted on this, and maybe that's the case. And in the end, obviously, they went with the Batwing style design. I think that was the best choice overall. So hope you enjoyed this top 10 features of the 59 Impala. Let me know what you thought. Did I forget anything? Put it in the comment section. And do you like this series? Let me know. Thanks again for watching.